Hello, and welcome to Lady Jane Live. Oh my goodness, it's here. It's here, guys. We are finally talking about Lolita. And for this very special broadcast, I have an incredibly special friend of mine, Kari. That's why, Kari from Very Literary Kari. Yay! Kari has been a regular guest here on Lady Jane Books. We have had some of the best buddy reads, Kari.
We have. We really have.
Yeah, I think this is
I
what.
mean, now,
Go ahead.
is this, I feel like everyone has been so good that if we ever have a bad buddy read, it's just going to be, I just don't know what's going to happen because they've all been great in their own way. I mean, we've had nonfiction, fiction, everything.
We have. The only way it's going to be bad is if the internet goes down. That's it. That's the only way it's going to be a bad Lady Jane and Kari live show. So, yes, we both read Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. So, the way that this happened is that when was it? It was about a year ago, right? Both of us had read My Dark Vanessa separately. And we weren't like booktube buddies at that time, but we actually bonded over that book because we read it at the same time, but not together. And so when we started having like booktube buddy conversations and, we started like vibing a little bit, I actually asked Kari, I was like, do you actually want to read Lolita? Because Lolita is kind of the basis of My Dark Vanessa, and My Dark Vanessa was so emotional. I didn't think I could handle it without my booktube buddy, Kari. And Kari graciously said, yeah, Jane, that's actually a really great idea. So we planned it, I think, from December. I think we've been waiting since December to do this. And then Kari, being the genius that she is, she found The Real Lolita by Sarah Wienman. And this is actually a nonfiction on a case that it has been said that Lolita is based off of. So we put it together and here we are. We're having our Lolitathon. So first I want to welcome Kari. Hi, Kari. How are you?
I am well, Jane. It's so good to be here again. I always enjoy talking to you.
Me too. Me too. So to start off, how about we do a little bit of non-spoilery starts? So I kind of had this grand vision of the stream, and I said to myself, let's talk about Lolita first, because that is the big one. And then we'll talk about some non-spoiler ideas first. We'll have some exciting questions that we're going to discuss. And then we'll move on to the Real Lolita, same format, some non-spoiler ideas, some discussion questions, and final thoughts. So that is the stream. So to start off, do you want to just talk about your first impressions of when you heard about Lolita and what you thought before you read it? Like, what was your impressions in that way, Kari?
Well, I think everybody would agree that Lolita has a very controversial reputation. And, I didn't know a whole lot about Lolita, but I have friends who are in an older generation, and I was just kind of struck by their perception of Lolita. So, of course, not having read the book, I did know, the basic synopsis of it, that it is about this character, Humbert Humbert, who has this unhealthy fascination with this 11-year-old girl. And, people in the older generation tended to lean on the idea that Lolita kind of started this, with Humbert Humbert. So I was very disturbed by that. And I really was hesitant to even read this book. And so I was really glad when you suggested we read it together, because I thought that that would make it a little bit easier to get through. And, because it was so heavily referenced in My Dark Vanessa, I really wanted to see what this was about. So that was kind of my first impression without having read the book. What about you, Jane?
So I agree with that idea. It was so heavily referenced in My Dark Vanessa that I was like, oh, we should actually probably read that because it would enrich our knowledge of My Dark Vanessa. And for me, it was kind of like this mythical book. You know what I mean? Like you had heard so much about it. You had heard that it's controversial and scary and creepy, and yet it's a classic, which I didn't quite understand before reading it. Because I was like, how can a book about a man falling in love with an 11-year-old girl be a classic? You know what I mean? Like it doesn't
Right.
translate. So I was like, okay, we have to see how it is. I honestly thought it was going to be way more overt than it was. I was kind of surprised on how the author presented a couple of things. And so now I can see why it's a classic because of those insights. But before reading it, I had no idea how this was going to turn out. And I will say it's a very different book than my initial thoughts before reading it. You know what I mean? Like when you picture a book about the subject matter, you have a certain preconceived notion about it. And this book
Sure.
was so different than anything that I thought it was going to be. So overall, I have to say it was a very, very different experience than I was expecting.
Yeah, I agree. Just because of the subject matter, I didn't really expect the prose to be so beautiful. Like, I really felt like this was a beautifully written book. And I do agree with what you said about it not being so overt. I do feel like My Dark Vanessa was definitely a more explicit book.
Absolutely. Yes.
However, I mean, and that book was very difficult to read as well, but I feel like that book was a little bit, it was easier to read because you were reading it from the victim's perspective. And
Mm,
so, um, you could really feel sympathy for her. And, it didn't give you this conflicted feeling. I mean, you could feel the conflicted emotions that she was feeling being in this, you know, um, relationship that was abusive with her teacher. But with this, it's a completely different experience. And I agree. I wasn't expecting this reading experience.
yeah, I think that's a pretty general case where it's very different than what you expect.
I
So
do feel like, though, we both kind of, and I think it helps the fact that, we had found this nonfiction book. I feel like we went into this book with clear eyes, and we're not going to be bamboozled
right.
by the
Hmm.
author.
Hmm.
So I do feel like our reading experience was probably, enhanced by that, where, you know, I, I do feel like this author is playing games with the reader a little bit. And I feel like we were a couple of moves ahead of him,
I
you know?
agree. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and I don't feel like people in the 1950s reading it were.
Yes, I absolutely
So,
agree. That was a
yeah.
point that I was going to bring up later too. But like us being very modern women of the world, we saw right through a lot of the tricks and double speak and the prose and kind of this weird befuddlement of what was going on. And I remember we talked so many times. I'm like, no, he is not doing X, Y, and Z right now. And I agree. I think that in the time that this was written, they didn't have that knowledge and they didn't have that openness and that kind of, I don't want to say confidence about recognizing certain aspects of this book. And I can definitely see why you would say that they wouldn't pick up on that because it is very subtle. And unless that you have modern knowledge of certain things that go on in the world like we do, you would never pick up on it. So I think that's a very good point, Kari.
Yeah, I think the 1950s, anything related to sex really wasn't discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like even if someone picked up on some of the things in the book, they may not discuss it. Maybe that's why they focus so much on how beautiful the prose was, how, flowery, Humbert
Yeah.
was, and how refined some of his speech was. Um, because it just wasn't discussed
Yeah.
then.
And especially with it involving a child.
Yeah.
That would just, it wouldn't even cross their mind. It's just unheard of back then.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree. What did you like most about this book?
I definitely liked the writing. I mean, I think we've talked about that a good bit. I did like how the narrator really addresses the reader. I mean, he really is bringing the reader into this experience and addressing you directly. Throughout the book, he refers to us as dear reader, and I don't know. I like that. It was a little creepy. I mean, it
Yeah,
was a little
like he's
creepy that he
watching
was
you, or
talking to us.
it's weird. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a little weird, but I appreciated that little method.
Excellent. What did you like least, do you think?
I mean, the subject matter.
Well, yes, I
I
mean, yeah.
think I think you know, because the subject matter is just so completely abhorrent and foreign to most people, I think that would probably prevent a lot of people from even attempting to read this book, even given its status as a classic and all of that. And I can completely understand that.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that. First of all, that's kind of a given with this book. I
yeah,
have to say, what I disliked is the ending. Like, I feel like we had just gone on this whole journey with Lolita and Humbert and their storyline, and then the ending just felt very cartoonish to me. It felt very like slapstick. It was a very weird, like out of left field type of ending for me. So I have to say that also annoyed me. That was one of the big drawbacks. I wish it had a different ending, because it felt weird to me. So that was
it's
my
funny. I mean, now that you say that, I can totally see that. But for me, I felt like the ending, it was a natural conclusion. Like I feel like Humbert throughout the book, there's an escalation and
yeah
there's really like a descent into madness. So I completely understand that the ending was kind of bizarre.
yeah. The
Um,
whole thing was bizarre. Like when you look
well,
at
yeah,
it from start to
yeah,
finish,
the whole thing
he
was
licked
bizarre.
her eyeball, Carrie. That was bizarre.
Oh,
Sorry,
I can't.
sorry, sorry. Spoilers. He licks her eyeball. It's really weird.
um, yeah, so I kind of felt like because he was becoming so erratic that kind of fit in a weird way, the
Okay.
ending.
Okay, I could understand that. I feel like at the end when they introduce this other character and then he becomes the target, it felt very random to me. But I can appreciate your views, Carrie.
Yeah, I do agree with that because I feel like he was introduced early on,
But
but
not
not in a
really
way
though.
that like drew my attention to him. Like I had to really think, now who is that?
Yeah, I'm like,
Like I had to
who?
really think
Where?
back who
Yeah.
he
Stephen,
was
where?
and
With who? Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like,
Um
I don't quite remember him. So yeah.
and I remember like when he's trying to find this person, it's very confusing and he's, trying to track down these different pseudonyms and that sort of thing. So I feel like maybe that was also just um because we were in Humbert's mind.
Yeah.
So because he was kind of confused as to where this came from, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
maybe we were too. I, I don't know. Maybe I'm
Mm,
thinking too much about it, but
no. No, no, no such thing. So I do have some discussion questions about Lolita. Now I am going to warn our dear viewers, in talking about these, there will be spoilers, unfortunately. So if you are not interested in being spoiled for Lolita, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. But just so you know, in answering some of these discussion questions, there ultimately will be some spoilers. So thank you, and let us begin. So my first question is that Lolita begins with this very strange forward by this other fictional character that's not actually within the book. And I want to know why you think that Nabokov chose to frame his novel this way. Because at the beginning, there's a lot of spoilers. Like there is actually a lot of spoilers at the very, very beginning within the first page. And yet we have to go through all of this to find out they're spoilers. So what did you think, Kari? Why, like, what was your impression of that forward? Because I know we had talked about it briefly early on.
I really liked it. After reading the book, I felt like that was part of the game. I feel like that was part of Nabokov playing with us, because by the end of the book, you know, he could always say, look, I mean, if you look at the forward, I've already told you through the voice of a psychologist what a lunatic this guy is. We've already told you he's a murderer. And so why are you shocked?
Yeah.
You know,
That's
why
a
are
good
you shocked?
point. Yeah. Yeah.
So I really feel like this was, and I mean, I'm holding on to the hope that it was a cautionary tale, and that he, you know, he does, you know, make, I guess, some people become, you know, enthralled with Humbert Humbert to prove a point, you know, to prove that point that, you know, evil lurks everywhere, and evil can be a very, you know, affluent person that speaks different languages and that's very intelligent and, you know, lives next door to you and all those things. But yeah, I was confused when I first read the forward. I was like, what is this? Who is this character? John, I think his name was John Ray, the psychologist. But once I read the book, I was like, okay, I see what you did there. I see what you did there, and I like it. So what did you think?
So I actually think that I see it a little bit more as a literary device, because I thought it was interesting that he introduced the characters through different names at the time. You know what I mean? Like at that time, Dolores had changed her name. You know what I mean? The book's name is Lolita. We're looking for the word Lolita. But I think he introduced her as saying, oh, so-and-so who had died in childbirth. And to us, we didn't understand, because we're like, okay, she's it's her married name. We don't associate that name with Lolita, with the character Lolita.
Right.
So I think it was a little bit playing into the game, like you had said, that like, oh, I've already told you that she's dead, but like you forget that, you know what I mean? And I think that was more of a literary device that Nabokov was using rather than anything else. So because it just felt weird to me at the very beginning, you know, you won't know that he was referring to Lolita until the very, very end. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah. So it kind of takes you by surprise, and you're like, oh, wait, yeah, I did read about that, huh? So I think it's kind of this lulling the reader into like a false sense of security almost, because, you know, you're saying that she's dead, but you're talking about her as Lolita throughout this entire book. So it's kind of like this dissonance that you don't know what happened to her until you realize at the very, very end, you're like, oh, wait, he told us that like at the very beginning. Which also relates a lot to Humbert's character. Like Humbert is very upfront about a lot of his flaws and a lot of his issues. And yet when we're going through the book, a lot of readers forget about them. A lot of people who think that Lolita is a romance, which it's not, they tend to forget about Humbert's bad qualities. So I do think this is all related to his like gamification of the entire storyline. So that was my thought, but I think he used it mostly as a literary device. Next question.
Yeah, and I
sorry. Go ahead, Kari.
yeah, and I think he also used it to kind of explain, I guess, the pseudonyms too, that are used in the book, because he talks about the, you know, the narrator, I guess, gave himself the pseudonym Humbert Humbert. And then Hayes, Dolores's last name, was also a pseudonym. So yeah, and that kind of stuck out to me a little bit too, because, you know, giving the characters pseudonyms kind of implies that they're real life people that need to be protected. And that kind of gets into the second book that we read. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting. And of course, I was kind of looking for those things. We both were, you know, knowing that this may have a connection to a true to life case. Yeah, that's one thing that stuck out to me. It's like, okay, he points out that they're using pseudonyms here. Very interesting.
Speaking of names, that actually dives into my second question. So obviously the protagonist's name is Humbert Humbert, which is kind of a funny name, like you wouldn't suspect a name of that in a book of Lolita. I have this question of whether or not having him have such a disarming, goofy name actually works in kind of disarming the reader again, because you can't think that a guy named Humbert Humbert is evil. You know what I mean? It's not like, Scar or something like really dark or really obvious that, you're like, oh, this is a bad guy. Humbert Humbert, when you even say it, it sounds silly. You know what I mean? So that actually got me thinking that we don't actually know who Humbert is based on his name, right? Like you wouldn't think that Humbert is a bad guy. So, and when I was looking through, I noticed that Lolita also has a lot of nicknames in this book. So I think there's Dolores, there's Lolita, there's Lo, there's, I think, a couple of other ones. Dolly in school, she's Dolly. So, what impact do you think of having these names had in the book? And what do you think Nabokov was trying to convey of having, first, Humbert's very silly name, and second of all, having Lolita's multiple nicknames?
That's an interesting question. When I think of the name Humbert Humbert, I mean, it to me, I think of the word like humdrum. Like it's just like a, boring kind of normal name.
I think of it like bah humbug, like just kind of like,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's kind of funny that it's, two names back to back for first and last. And one thing that we talked about while we were reading this book is that a lot of people commented on how funny this book was. And, I don't know if maybe the name and some of his antics, I guess, accompanied with the name kind of contributed to that. I'm not sure. I mean, I think there were a couple instances of dialogue that was maybe funny, but I mean, the general tone of this book for us was definitely not funny. It was very dark. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if maybe that's what contributed to people thinking it was comical in some way. With Lolita, names are kind of interesting because, I have like a family nickname. There's, people have nicknames and things. But it's almost like it speaks to your identity. So it's kind of like Humbert hijacking Lolita's identity. I mean, he's kind of hijacking her. He kind of wants to possess her. He wants to imprison her. That's kind of how I took that. And I mean, he's objectifying her. He's dehumanizing her. He's, all of those things. And I think maybe the nicknames play into that.
I agree. I actually had another thought spinning off of that, is that we never really get to see who Lolita is. We see who she is to Humbert. We see her as this object, as this almost mythical being. We see her who she is to her mother, a pretty unsavory character. Her mom is not a fan of Lolita. And we see her like in all these other atmospheres. But we never really get to see, except for one instance, we get this one tiny, tiny view into who Lolita actually is. And so I think that using these different nicknames was a way for Nabokov to really illustrate that we don't know who Lolita is. And that can really also be personified in this idea that some people think that she started the relationship. Some people think she's not as innocent, that she's not a victim. And then other people say she's 1000% a victim like we do. So, but the thing is that you don't know who Lolita is because she's a different thing to every character. And I think this is actually a really interesting display on, it's hard to explain. It's a way of saying that like, she is a reflection of what everybody else wants her to be. So her mother wants her to be a villain. Humbert wants her to be this mythical creature, but none of them are actually accounting for who she is as an individual. I think there's a very powerful message in that. I think that you can definitely say that it's illustration of society as a whole, especially when it comes to like being a woman. I think that that's why he used so many names. And I think that one instance when we saw a tiny glimpse of her intelligence, it was like a sentence. Like you would not, do you remember that? When you would not pick up on it if you weren't looking for it. And it's that little tiny hint of Lolita's a whole complex character on her own. And we will never be able to find out about that because we're limited to Humbert's perspective of her. And to Humbert's perspective of her is very selfish. So I think that's what he was using with all these different names, but I want to hear what you think, Kari.
Well, I think you really hit on something that I was going to mention as well. I think that's just no. That's just a symptom of the time. And I think the societal constraints on women, women were, put into these little boxes and they had to be the perfect little housewife and they had to dress a certain way. And I found it really, hypocritical that Humbert would complain about how materialistic and shallow Lolita was when really that's what society wanted her to be. They didn't really want her to have independent thoughts or opinions or ambitions because that didn't fit what was expected of women at that particular time. So it's kind of weird to me that you would want her to be independent or have an independent thought when you really don't want that, because you really just want to, imprison her and, use her for your own purposes. So yeah, I definitely agree. With what you said there.
I liked it because it was so subtle though. You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't pick up that she had all these nicknames. You wouldn't pick up that we did see a tiny glimpse of her character unless you were really looking for it. And like you said, I don't think the 1950s audience would pick up on that. But it's interesting to read it as a modern woman now because we can. So I thought that was really cool.
And some of the stuff, some of the things, reading it as a modern reader and as, an educator and someone who is like trained to look for symptoms of abuse and things like that. Like, I feel like a lot of Lolita's actions and things she said, outbursts she had, even, when Humbert hints at her promiscuity, like all of those things could be symptoms of the abuse. All of those things are, coping mechanisms. All of those things are cries for help. Victims of sexual assault do start to associate their self-worth with sexuality. And so it's not uncommon for those sorts of victims to be kind of overtly sexual. So yeah, and I don't think obviously the 1950s reader, they took it a completely different way, right? But looking at that, it was so clear to me. We even, when we were reading the book, Jane, I remember we were talking about it and I was like, we don't know anything about Lolita's real father other than the fact that he died when she was a young child. And so we don't know, if she was a victim of abuse prior to this. And maybe that is what caused a lot of the animosity between her mother and her.
That's very possible.
We don't know because Humbert was a boarder at her mother's house. We don't know what other male boarders she hosted in her house and what they could have possibly done to Lolita. So there are a lot of unknowns. And I feel like just what you said, we don't know about Lolita. We don't really know about the true Lolita. So that's really, really a sad thing. You kind of, you want to hear from her.
Absolutely. And that actually is a really good point too, that you made. It is possible that she suffered abuse from other people, around her as well. And I think that actually is a very, very interesting explanation for why there's so much animosity with her mother, because at the time in the 1950s, there was a totally different idea of victim blaming. I feel like victim blaming was way more prevalent in the 1950s, especially with this type of subject matter. And she almost was a personification of that. If Lolita had been hurt by somebody else, it's very possible that the mother resented Lolita for that rather than the person who hurt her. Unfortunately, that could be a possibility within this book. Again, we won't know, but I think that's a very interesting theory because her mom is so hostile to her. She doesn't have anything nice to say. She calls her a brat. She calls her like all these horrible names. They have a really, really rocky, tumultuous relationship. And it appears that the mother really resents her for something. So I think that's a very good theory, Kari. Again, we won't be able to prove it, but I think that's a really, really spot on idea and potential backstory too. I hadn't thought of that. So it's very interesting that you picked up on that.
Yeah, and I think you're right about the mother's animosity. Like I don't think it was uncommon for children, if they even could articulate what was happening to them, because that's another thing too, because there was such a lack of education for young girls and boys, but particularly young girls, about like what's going on with their bodies and things like that, if something was going on, I don't know that children would be able to articulate it. And when they did, I don't think it's improbable that they would be blamed for kind of messing up the status quo and
the quiet, happy little life. Yeah,
it's right.
Heartbreaking.
And in the first few pages, I think Humbert even referred to Lolita as like a demon child. So I was like, okay, here we go. Here's the victim blaming. We're just going to go ahead and start that. Yes. And then with the mom kind of reiterating some of those thoughts, it was hard to read.
It was heartbreaking. It really, really was. But I think it definitely plays into a bigger part of the story than a reader would initially think. So I thought that was interesting. We actually touched on a couple of things here already. So what role do you think Humbert's early experience with childhood romance affected this entire book? So I know that Humbert had this like childhood crush, and it was unfulfilled. Like she passed away, and so he will never like get to live out this romance with his first love. What impact do you think that had on the book, and particularly with Humbert as a character and all of this weird and wonderful stuff with Lolita?
Well, that was interesting because when he talked about that was one of the very first parts of the book that he was self-reflective. I mean, he really talked about that young girl, Annabelle, and his experience there. And he really seemed to reflect on that and reflect on himself and the fact that maybe there was something wrong with him. And maybe it did, go back even that far, that it was something deep seated in him that was wrong. So at first I was like, okay, he's actually kind of self-reflective. Maybe he's going to be repentant and, that sort of thing. But no.
Of course not. This is Humbert. Of course not.
It became very clear that he had no regard for what he termed nymphets or the victims and their feelings in this at all. So yeah, I don't really know what role it really played in him. I don't know if that's just the idealization, where that comes from, like, this ideal age and this ideal look that he's looking for. I guess maybe that was rooted in Annabelle, but I don't really know what else that would have affected.
I actually saw it as Humbert's excuse. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people who hurt other people, they'll say, oh, well, that happened to me, or, that, X, Y, and Z. And to him, it's kind of him giving up the choice, to act this way. That's how I felt. I was like, okay, even though this really, really bad thing happened to you and to, your first love, that doesn't excuse you from hurting Lolita. You know what I mean? And I felt like it was almost him appealing to the reader, saying, well, I had this great love, and unfortunately we couldn't be together, and I've just been stuck in this like repetitive cycle, and Lolita's the person to fulfill my dreams. And to me, I wasn't buying it. I didn't buy it for a second. And I think that's why it was included in the book, so that way readers could choose to sympathize or not. We did not sympathize. I didn't sympathize.
Right. No.
But in that way, again, at the 1950s, we don't have the knowledge that we do now about, psychology and about this entire dynamic. So it's interesting to think about back then, if they would say, oh, it's so tragic. Now he's with Lolita because it's an unrequited love that he never could fulfill in his childhood. Oh, but now we're just like, no. So I personally saw that as Humbert's trying to manipulate the audience to get the sympathy and to kind of excuse his actions with Lolita. And I didn't buy it for a second. So I think that's that whole relationship. Otherwise, there was really no reason to include it within the story. But that was my opinion. That was my thought as an idea.
Yeah. I'll go with that.
Okay. Okay. So let's see. So Humbert actually was married early on in the book. So he had a wife called Valeria, I think her name is. Valeria. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. But let's talk a little bit about their marriage, their brief marriage, because I do think that's really important to touch upon, because Lolita and Dolores are not the only women in Humbert's life within this story. So how does Humbert's marriage to Valeria foreshadow his relationships to both Charlotte, who is Dolores's mom, as well as who is Lolita's mom, as well as Lolita herself? What do you think, Kari?
Well, I think that relationship made it pretty clear that Humbert has a propensity for violence.
Yeah.
I think that was very clear from the outset. And I also think that it really clearly exposed his vanity and his need to possess things, and this being all about control, because he really did not care for Valeria until he could not control her. When she was planning to leave him with the taxi cab driver, he went ballistic, and that's when he really became very violent and out of control. Whereas before in the relationship, it was just, he was just kind of going through the motions. There was really nothing too crazy with it. As soon as she decided to leave, that was it. So I think that definitely was illustrated in that relationship. And then two, he mentioned a very bizarre thing with Valeria that really stuck out to me. And I was like, why in the world would you include this? But he talked about how Valeria and her husband end up in California, and they end up in this weird experiment where they eat nothing but bananas and dates, and they're walking around on all fours. And this played right back into his, references to animals.
That was another question I had. Yeah.
So it's, again, he's dehumanizing. But actually, I think I read this in the Real Lolita. Nabokov had seen like a newspaper article or something about an ape who drew a picture, and he drew a picture of the bars to his cage.
Oh.
So, that, I feel like that was
I remember
somehow
that.
inspired. I feel like that inspired a lot of the animal references here. But yeah, I thought that was a very bizarre tale, and it was just another way for Humbert to dehumanize her, because we don't even know if it's true. I mean, here's the thing with Humbert: he is a lunatic. He's a psychopath, and so we don't even know what in this narrative is true.
That's right. That's right. And that was actually another one of my questions, and I'm glad you brought it up, that there is a lot of animal imagery in this book. He refers to Lolita as like her monkeyish feet, or um, there's other like really, really weird like animal imagery when he describes both Lolita and other people as well within the book. I was actually going to ask you what you think the point of that was, but I think that it was his way of saying I'm better than everybody else. You know what I mean? To everybody else, they're animals. They're, you know, not as intelligent as me. They're beneath me. I am like the king of this hierarchy or something like that. I think that plays and shows his mental state, and about um, you know, how highly he regarded himself and his intelligence versus his opinions of everybody else around him. And it he sees himself as very separate from everybody else as well. I personally think that's why Nabokov used a lot of like the animalistic language in this book, to really illustrate that and Humbert's opinion of himself. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that was another question that I had. So exciting. I definitely agree that Valeria was the first instance that we see what Humbert's capable of. You know what I mean? Like, he said something kind of weird, like he was like a perfect husband, you know, everything was fine. But then as soon as she said, I'm leaving you for the taxi cab driver, he hit her. And it's written in a way that you minimize it. He's like, I swatted her leg or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, it was a very gentle sentence, but when you look at it objectively, he hit her because he was no longer possessing her. He was no longer in control of what was happening to her and to him and to their marriage. And I think that was a tiny glimpse into what was going to happen later with Quilty, because he realized that he no longer possessed Lolita, that Quilty had influenced her to run away with him. And that explains the violence that he displayed onto Quilty, too. So I think it was almost like a foreshadowing device of saying, okay, he's actually really, really violent when he doesn't get his way. So, but it's very subtle. This whole book is extremely subtle with Humbert's characterization and with his propensity to violence. So that's what I thought Valeria kind of served as within this book. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I think even like with Lolita's mom, we see there's a scene where they are at the lake and
Mm.
everything is kind of normal, but then we're inside Humbert's head and we hear about him basically plotting to murder her right there at the lake on this fine day. And he ends up not doing it, but you know, that's another female relationship he has that clearly shows he is capable of not only violence, but he's capable of murder.
Yeah.
And he has told us from the very beginning, he told us, and the psychologist in the forward told us that he is a murderer. He's a bad guy. So it is just flabbergasting that, you know, people can minimize that or overlook that somehow. And I think that's again, I think that's part of the game that Nabokov was playing. And you know, one thing that the real Lolita brought up was that Nabokov's wife was just so disappointed that people did not give voice to Lolita, because she felt like Lolita was a very strong character. She was a survivor, she was a victim, and she felt like that was lost in all of the hubbub surrounding Lolita. So, you know, I kind of feel like if she feels that way, and of course, you know, I haven't read any, you know, interviews with Vladimir Nabokov. I don't know what his intention was here, but, you know, based on what I've read, I think, you know, his intention was to point out that hypocrisy, to point out that, you know, flowery language and the way someone appears and, you know, the intellectual nature of Humbert and that sort of thing, that can hide a lot. And, you know, you might have the nice house with the white picket fence and all of that, but what's going on behind closed doors is a whole different story. And I think he was trying to point that out. I hope he was trying to point that out, but I think for some people that just gets completely lost.
I agree. And you know who that kind of reminds me of, Kari?
Who?
Ted Bundy.
My
It does.
gosh.
No, it does, because it's the same thing. Everybody was charmed by him and his mannerisms and his manners, and yet he was doing some of the most atrocious things behind closed doors. So I'm sorry, I had to make my Ted Bundy reference. So okay. So this next part is kind of a two-parter. First is, can Humbert ever be said to actually love Lolita? What do you think? Like, do you think that he actually loved her?
I don't think he's capable of love.
That's what I was going to say too.
Yeah, I don't think he's capable of love. And I think that we've talked about this before with some other books we've read about serial killers, that, you know, science has shown that there are parts of the brain that are underdeveloped in a lot of these people. So, you know, serial killers and people that end up, you know, committing these violent crimes, the part of the brain that really deals with empathy and being able to care for and love people is underdeveloped. There's something wrong with that person's brain, and I don't think he's capable of it. Like, I don't think he is.
Yeah, I think to Humbert, he's capable of it. Like, in Humbert's mind, he did love Lolita, but objectively, anybody else with a reasonable mind can say that's not love. That is not love by any means. And he actually,
He's
I agree.
delusional.
Exactly. He has the delusion of
people
love.
believe their delusions. I mean, if they took a lie detector test, if someone was
It would come back
delusional,
clear. Yeah,
they would pass because they believe it.
Yeah. I know. So I think to Humbert he did, but to the reader and to anybody outside of Humbert's mind, he's not capable, and it's not love. So totally I'm glad that you said that, because I was going to say the same thing. So if we suspend our disbelief for a little bit and we accept Humbert at his word on the happenings in this book, it's kind of implied that Lolita started this relationship, right? So, and yet later we see that even Humbert observes that Lolita would cry every night when they were on the run. And as we've said, a lot of people think that Lolita was actually the perpetrator in all of this, that she was like the mastermind. But should we read this as, well, how should we read this? Should we read this as Lolita was kind of caught up in this game and it just kind of got too big for her and she, you know, it kind of came out of control? Or because Humbert's insane, do we immediately discount that? That's a question a lot of people ask, actually. So I want to hear your thoughts.
I think Lolita is a child.
I agree.
Who doesn't have the mental capacity to even realize the consequences, long-term consequences of her actions, or to maybe even realize that something she does is inappropriate. And I don't think it's the role of the child to always make that determination. That's why the child has parents who should be watching the child and should know, you know, should know what's going on there. And yeah, I just have there's a clear line there for me, and I just cannot, you know, it doesn't matter what she did.
Right. I think
that's the point. I mean, I think that's the point with victim blaming. It's like, you know, okay, well, it doesn't matter what the person was wearing. It doesn't matter what they may have said before. It doesn't even matter if Lolita at that tender age had even experimented with a boy at summer camp or something like that. None of that matters in relation to this relationship with Humbert, because he is the adult. And not only is he the adult, he's supposed to be her stepfather.
That's right.
I think he's the one that's supposed to look out for her.
Yeah, protect her at all costs. I think that idea of Lolita initiating the relationship is totally Humbert's delusion. I think
Yeah.
that's just 1000% for me illustrates that, you know, he may believe this, but it's not reality. It's not
Yeah.
the full dynamic of what was happening. That Lolita is a child, you know, and
And I
like you were
think,
saying, it doesn't matter. Like, even if she was like, I don't know, doing X, Y, and Z, it doesn't matter because she
yeah,
is a child. But to Humbert, it's his way of passing off the guilt. It's his
yeah.
way of saying, like, well, it wasn't my responsibility. Yes, it was 1000%. The sun came out. I'm sorry. I know I look a little bit, little overexposed here, but that to me is just another illustration of Humbert not taking responsibility for this and
Yeah.
trying to manipulate the reader into victim blaming and to washing his hands of all this horrible things that he's been doing. Thankfully, you and I see straight through this. But again, like we've said, in the 1950s, there may be that seed of doubt there, unfortunately. But it says way more about Humbert's character that's implied than it does about Lolita for me. And to me, it's just another, you know, piece of evidence that we cannot trust Humbert at his word at all by any means.
Well, and there's, it's something you said triggered this for me. Throughout the book, he does pick up on like little minor details throughout his life and tries to make connections.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't think the connections are there. So I feel like he's doing the same thing with Lolita. Like Lolita, she may have been even a bratty kid, and maybe she was trying to get attention. Maybe she was just innocuously, playing around, or maybe she was just eating ice cream, and he creates this whole,
Exactly. It's his
it,
creation. It's not
right.
Lolita. It's all Humbert's perception.
Yeah, it's his obsession. He's the one with the obsession. It's not Lolita.
Good. Yep. Good. 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 So that was all my questions for Lolita. We are going to talk a little bit, probably more about it in our next segment, which is talking about the real Lolita. So this was a nonfiction about a girl named Sally Horner, who is that how you say her name? Horner?
Horner, is it
Horner?
Horner or
Horner? I
yeah?
think it's Horner. Yeah. Sally Horner, who was also abducted around the time that Lolita was being written. And there's a lot of controversy on whether Nabokov actually took Sally's story and created it into Lolita. And there is a lot of back and forth about this, including Nabokov's own opinions. But basically, that's what this book is about. And it talks. I'm so sorry, it's so bright. And it talks about kind of the connections between Lolita and the Sally Horner case. So, what was your impressions first about what you liked about this book, Kari? What you didn't like? What was your overall like ideas of the nonfiction aspect of this buddy read?
Well, I really think this author did a great job, because it sounded like she did extensive research, and even after she had finished the book, some documents that she had been looking for finally came through. And so she even in the afterword kind of added a little bit there. So I feel like she really did her research. Um, of course, she does have to kind of fill in the gaps with some of this. And I actually marked a page. She talked about captivity narratives such as the recent found alive stories of young women, including Elizabeth Smart, J.C. Dugard, and the trio Ariel Castro held prisoner in Cleveland, open up a psychological trapdoor into Sally's probable state of mind. So I do think, those narratives really allowed her to kind of understand um, a little bit more about the psychological abuse that takes place in these abductions. So I wasn't, thrown off by her use of those at all, because we don't know some things about the perpetrator in this crime, and we don't know some things about Sally Horner. So I feel like she did a great deal of research.
I agree. And I really appreciated that she also put in other crimes, and like you were mentioning the other real life cases of people who have been abducted and held in captivity, unfortunately. Um, I really liked how she made connections like that, and she talked about other cases as well, because it brought awareness that this is something that's happened. I think there's this idea of, well, that could never actually happen. Yeah, it could, and it did. So I do like how she kind of weaved in other aspects within this book, and not just about Sally, but about overall themes and um, things about what happened in cases like this. I thought that was really brilliant, because it also kind of opened up the reader's eyes that there's a lot to go on. There's a lot of dynamics with cases like this. So I thought that was really interesting. I liked the writing style. It was very conversational, and it was very informative without being too bogged down in details. I do think that's because she doesn't have all the details, but I do think
Right.
for in places where she doesn't have that, she's very honest, saying, I don't have anything for you here. She may have felt like this, she may have felt like that, but it wasn't in a way that I felt cheated out of any part of the story. You know what I mean? Like, she did, for what she had, she made it interesting and engaging, even if she may not have had all the details. So I personally really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and I
So,
really liked how she also included, you talked about her incorporating other true crime cases. She also incorporated a lot of cases from Camden, New Jersey, which is where Sally Horner was from. And I think that really illustrated the changing times, because
mhm.
at the time of Sally's abduction in 1948, that city was very up and coming. I mean, you had Campbell's Soup that was there in the town. You had all sorts of other industries that were coming into the town, and it was a very, kind of up and coming sort of city. And then with Sally Horner's case, and then with a couple of other very high profile cases that she mentions, one is called the Walk of Death. That one
Mm.
is quite
Yeah,
bizarre.
it's
um
heartbreaking.
yeah,
It's really scary. Yeah.
with those cases, I think she's really trying to illustrate that the times are changing. We are going from this time period of innocence to this time period where you do have these, mass killings, you do have these kidnappings, and,
Murder
Nabokov
for
is writing,
hires, bunch of murder for
yeah,
hires from a
oh,
preacher, and I'm like,
from a preacher. Yeah, that was crazy. And the fact that the poor girl in that case was buried next to her murderer, who was her father. It's just kind of crazy. But
yeah, yeah.
um,
I hadn't heard of that case before, and I was like, this is wild.
yeah, there was some wild stuff in here, and I feel like, there's clear evidence that Nabokov was aware of Sally Horner's case. I mean, there is an index card where he wrote down notes about it, so you can't deny that. In the later part of Lolita, he actually mentions by name Sally Horner and Frank LaSalle.
Mhm.
So he was definitely aware of that case, and he was probably aware of some of these others. So I feel like, he understands that he's living in a very changing time for America.
Mm.
And one thing, and I don't, this doesn't even relate to your question, but it's just something that I really liked and noticed about the book.
Bring it, Kari.
In Lolita, when he does the cross country traveling
Mm.
with Lolita, there's some really just cool descriptions of the sightseeing, and it's almost like you're seeing it from the passenger side window. You're just driving through, and you're just getting these little blips of Americana from the 1950s, and these little roadside stops and these diners and these, attractions. You're getting these little blips, and
Burger shops, and yeah, and the movies. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I really liked that part of the book. And, Nabokov took, we learned from this book, he took several cross country trips to go butterfly hunting.
Mm.
He was interested in butterflies, and he wanted um, to go explore that. So I mean, he made several trips that definitely influenced this novel. And I kind of feel like it's a tale of the loss of something, the loss of American innocence, the way he's describing some of these attractions and some of these hotels. It goes from very enchanting and exciting to very, derelict and kind of depressing. So I feel like he's in capturing something about America at the time too, that maybe, is a bit uncomfortable for people to read about, especially since Nabokov is an immigrant. I mean, he's a foreigner. He's not, from America. So it's almost like, he's exposing a little something there.
The dirty laundry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's so interesting to me because as reading this, it was obvious that Nabokov said, this is not about Sally Honor. It's not. It's definitely not. And yet, I think I said to you early on, it sounds like the lady doth protest too much a little bit.
Yes.
Because as we're reading it, I'm like, come on, really? You can say it, Vladimir. It's okay. Like, you can admit that you took inspiration. Yeah. It's not a bad thing. But it's kind of interesting to me that he would be so against saying that it was based off of Sally Hunter's case. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, there's really no reason to deny it. I don't know if there was a, change. I don't know about like at the times, like how, how he presented it, whatever.
You know
but
what
to
I
me,
think it was?
Go ahead. I that confused me a bit. So go ahead.
I think that because he, we know he started writing Lolita prior to the Sally Horner case. I think that he was afraid that his work that he started prior to that case would be completely overshadowed by it if he admitted that it was influenced by the Sally Horner case. Because I think, we picked up, and what you said there, the lady does protest too much. I mean, it's clear. It's clear that this is inspired by the Sally Horner case. And it's probably best illustrated by the fact that Lolita dies tragically, in childbirth after she has escaped Humbert Humbert. And we know that Sally Horner, unfortunately, she is rescued, but she dies tragically in a car accident. So,
that was heartbreaking.
It's some very close parallels to the case that I don't think he can deny, but I think he was concerned that it would be overshadowed. And I think he was also maybe concerned about some legal issues, because one thing that she brought up in the Real Lolita was the first publisher that agreed to publish Lolita. It was a foreign publisher, and I can't remember the name of the company or anything, but there was some sort of weird contract that he had to get out of, and it took him a long time to get out of his contract so that Lolita could be published here in America. And
that's right.
I feel like he was a little bit afraid that this would open him up to some other legal sort of battle.
Like maybe the family would say, hey, you're making money off of our tragedy. We expect royalties or something. That's a good point. I had not considered that before, so I'm glad that you mentioned that, Kari, because I forgot about that, to be totally honest. And that would make a lot of sense on why he was so adamant that it wasn't, but it obviously was. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I think that adds a lot of clarity for me. So, So, diving into my questions, Sally first encounters Frank LaSalle in Camden, New Jersey, at a critical moment in her life. As we know, she was stealing a notebook. And reading this, did you identify with her feelings at the time and why she chose what she did when Frank was approaching her and manipulating her? What do you think about like her actions, and do you empathize a little bit with Sally's ordeal at the very beginning? What did you think of that, Kari?
I definitely empathize with her because I was a very scared child. Well, I was, scared to get into trouble. And so, I can totally sympathize with this child. She has finally agreed to do this bad thing to impress her friends, and she gets caught by someone who claims to be an FBI agent, and he tells her that he's going to come back and get her, and she can't tell anybody, or she'll go to the reformatory, and
Which sounds like
I
what? Sounds like Humbert Humbert.
sounds like Humbert, yeah. I totally sympathize with her, and I know this is one of your other questions you talked about. Her mother makes a very strange comment to the press on several occasions. She says, "Whatever Sally has done, I can forgive her."
Hmm.
And as soon as she said that, I just cringed. I was like, oh my gosh, she has done nothing. She is a child who has been abducted. How dare you? But then the
Right.
more I thought about it, and the more I thought about Sally's circumstances, it made a little bit more sense to me, because I feel like her mom, knowing Sally and knowing that she's a very nervous child, probably, and very
Yeah.
scared of getting in trouble, maybe she is just kind of emphasizing that, she is safe, and that she is not mad,
Yeah.
about anything, and that sort of thing. So, the more I thought about that, it brought a little bit of clarity to what the mother said.
I agree. That is one of my questions for later, but let's touch upon that now, actually, too. I think a lot of people read that because Frank LaSalle did abuse Sally, just as Humbert was abusing Lolita on the run, and I think a lot of people read that as, kind of this idea, this victim blaming again. Whatever you did
Right.
to entice him into doing this, or whatever you've done on the road, I can forgive. And that also speaks to a lot of victim blaming and that kind of
Yeah.
1950s attitude that we were talking about. But I also think it's her way of comforting Sally, saying, I know you kept the secret from me. I know that, you know, he
Right.
wasn't the father of your childhood friends on the phone saying, oh, I'm going to take Sally away. I understand why you did what you did. Don't be afraid to come home, type of thing.
Right.
Because I can't imagine how overwhelming that would be for a child to, first of all, be in this really scary position where this strange man is saying, "You're so bad. I'm an FBI agent. We're gonna, take you away. Don't tell your mom." First of all, I can't imagine like a person her age just conceptualizing that. And second of all, the idea of holding that secret of what was happening, of him like manipulating her into not saying anything to her mom. And then, of course, what happened afterwards and all these really, really bad things that are happening to her. That is a lot of trauma for a small child to deal with. And so I think that instead of it being about what happened to her on the road with Frank LaSalle, it's more about the mother's comfort of saying, this is not your fault. But
Right.
they didn't have the same language to say that at the time. But I think that's what that meant more than anything else of the bad stuff that was going on. I think it was more of her comforting her to say, this isn't your fault. This was Frank's fault. I understand why you would be scared and why you did what you did and not telling me what's going on, but none of that actually matters. I just want you safe. So that's how I read that line. But I definitely think you can read it both ways.
Yeah, and I think my initial reaction was exactly what you said at the beginning, that, oh my gosh, this is victim blaming. How dare her? I had a
Yeah.
very, negative reaction to that.
Which
Because
there
she
might be
kept
some of
saying it.
that because again, this is a different
Yeah,
time period. So there may be, they don't want to say it overtly. And that
right.
it could also be present in that. I do think partially, but I think
Yeah,
it's more the second way. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, let's see. I had other questions. Oh, we already touched upon that. Yep, we already touched on the whatever she's done, I've forgiven her. Um, what do you think about now? I know we don't have a lot of details. This is one of the kind of gray areas that the author had. But what do you think of the period of time that Sally returned home for? So I know that there's kind of this weird time when victims do return home and everybody like kind of knows what happened to them, but nobody really wants to talk about it. How do you think that was handled in this book? Like, and what do you think about that, Kari?
Well, this book really it exposed something to me that I was unaware of. So when she's initially rescued, she does not get to go home immediately.
Yeah.
I mean, it was months. I forget exactly how long, but it was months that she was basically in the care of the state. And I think at one point it was like a juvenile detention center, but they had her separated
from the rough kids. Yeah.
Yeah. And, that, and of course she had a matron who it sounded like she took good care of her, took her shopping, that sort of thing. But that was really bizarre to me because I was thinking, oh my gosh, she has just been through so much trauma. And now she's being re-traumatized because she is being isolated from her family again. And, everything is uncertain where she's going to go, when she's going to get to go home. And all of that was in preparation for the trial. And I didn't quite understand why she couldn't go home. I didn't understand that unless there was some sort of like Child Protective Services investigation against her mother as to why Sally was allowed to go with Frank LaSalle. But you would think that would have been all fettered out before Sally was rescued because this had been an ongoing investigation for a couple of years. Yeah. So that was really bizarre to me. But when she finally did go home, I was so impressed with how Sally seemingly reacclimated to life. She did go stay with her sister, I believe, and her sister's husband for a while and worked in their greenhouse. And she went on dates. She, really just tried to get on with her life.
Resumed, yeah.
Which was very difficult because, and I know, there's a controversial decision that her mother makes to stay in Camden.
That was my next question too. So I'm glad we're talking about this.
Some of the detectives had encouraged her to start a new life elsewhere, change their names, that sort of thing. And it's a catch-22. I feel some sympathy for her mother because her mother is thinking, okay, she's been through so much change, so much trauma. Am I going to completely uproot her again? She's been moving around from city to city with this perpetrator. And now am I going to pick her up again and start all over?
Right.
That kind of also sends a signal. I mean, I think there are definitely some merits to that, but it also kind of sends a signal that you're ruined or you're old. We have to change your name because that it kind of sends a negative signal too. So I can understand maybe her wanting to stay, but of course that brings up all of the challenges of going to school with people who know what happened to you and them not seeing you as a victim. They see you as this promiscuous girl and just how horrific that is.
I agree.
So I was really impressed with her resilience. It just, I mean, I know we don't get a lot of details, but it really did seem like, to me, she reacclimated very well.
I agree. Speaking on the first point that you made, that being surprised that she couldn't go home, I personally think that might be like maybe witness tampering or something like that. That's what I thought. Maybe they wanted to protect, like, if she had to make a statement, they didn't want like too many outside influences. That's the only thing that I could think about, them why she couldn't go home right away. I also think that at the time, law enforcement had not dealt with a lot of cases like this. I think for the time period, she might have been like the first one that was found alive and actually like went back. So maybe they just didn't have the experience to, say, okay, well, what do we do now? It's kind of a this unknown, like, well, what do we do? How do we process this? Because they've never like had somebody in this situation before. So that was my thought too. What did you think, Kari?
Well, you bring up a good point with that because, like, even today, most missing children are runaways, and they are returned home. They come home. So I mean, and I think the statistics are pretty startling. I want to say it's like 90 some percent. I mean, it's very large percentage are runaways. So I think that may have also contributed to what the mother said as well. Whatever you have done, I can forgive, because I think even, and we learn in this book, even the authorities don't really take it seriously, and the FBI even didn't really investigate, because they were like, oh well, this guy might be your dad, and just some weird things there. So I think there was this idea that this doesn't happen,
Right.
you know,
What do we do?
like you
Yeah. Oh my
said.
goodness, what do we do?
And so, yeah, I think that definitely impacted the case, for sure. Yeah.
Something that I picked up on too is that it's almost like her abduction didn't happen. Like, I know we don't get a lot of like details, but, and maybe this is again the sign of the times, but I think that the author kind of implied that Sally didn't really talk about it, the family didn't really talk about it, and they just kind of, like, as you said, picked up where they left off. Now that is a great thing for Sally, you know, that she was able to kind of move on. But I just think, like, especially in the ensuing days where she was found, it was a very bizarre thing for me to think about, because I'm like, this giant, tragic, horrible thing just happened to this girl, and yet you guys are going to like ignore it. You know what I mean? It felt very strange to me. That's something that I can't really picture. I think it may have been good for Sally, so that way she could kind of just pick up, as you said, and continue on. And maybe that's how she dealt with it. But to me, it was kind of strange. It was like nobody wanted to acknowledge what she had been through. So that was kind of like my thing, that, you know, it was like, almost like the family didn't talk about it. You know, like it was a very bizarre thing for me to read personally.
Yeah, and I mean, I can kind of understand that a bit too, because if you're in that situation, there's a fine line between being there for someone and letting them talk about something, and then also like re-traumatizing them. Like, you
True.
don't want to,
True.
you don't want to say anything wrong. So
Right.
some people
No,
just don't say anything.
I don't mean that. I
Yeah.
mean, it was kind of like the family's not acknowledging it. You know what I mean? Like, not, to me, it felt like the family didn't want to acknowledge it with her. I don't know if Sally did or not. That's something that we won't know throughout this book. But it just felt like to me that to the family it didn't exist. You know what I mean? Just like, we're not going to think about that. We're going to move on, type of thing. So it was just a kind of a bizarre thing for me to think about, because I hadn't thought about the aftermath of something like that before. So.
Right. I mean, now we have all of these services,
Right,
social
exactly.
services that are
Right.
in
Like, there's
place
no,
that,
yeah, like, yeah.
right, that, kind of pick up, and they know right where to do and what to
Yeah.
do and who to refer you to for
Yeah.
counseling or whatever,
Exactly. That's it.
medical
Like, there was
attention or
no
whatever it is you
counseling.
need. Yeah.
Yeah, like for Sally, there was no counseling. It was just kind of like this expected of, okay, moving on. You know,
Right.
that's, I think, what I was trying to vocalize, but I didn't have the right words. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. That's exactly what I meant, that there was no counseling in that way. So that was difficult for me to kind of wrap my head around personally. So, let's see. Okay, we actually did touch on a lot of our questions in that, with being a storyteller and her treatment after school. Do you think Lolita could be published today? And if so, what do you think the reception would be like?
Wow. I don't know, because, one of the things that I read at the end of the Real Lolita, which really disturbed me, was that there is a whole type of anime that is based on this Lolita aesthetic.
I did not know that.
Yes. And it is pretty kind of, sexual in nature and that sort of thing. with the female characters.
Yeah,
So
when I read that, I didn't know it either. I was like,
yeah.
oh, yeah.
So I don't know, with stuff like that out there, part of me would say, well, yeah, I guess sure at this point, kind of anything goes, but I don't know. I don't know. I think My Dark Vanessa, even that is controversial, and I think that is definitely more acceptable for people because you are getting the victim's voice.
Mhm.
And so you really can't, I mean, it's her story. So you can't really, say too much against that. Um, with this being the perpetrator, I don't know. I
It's a
don't
good
know.
question. It's a good
Yeah.
question. I think that I think for the time, I understand why it was so shocking. Because as we've mentioned, child abduction was not talked about. Abuse was certainly not talked about, especially the type that Sally and Lolita experienced. Um, so, and obviously now, like we've mentioned, we've lived through other cases that, this has happened to real life people. And we never stop getting shocked by it. You know what I mean? Like all of those cases when they were happening, it shocked everybody and they couldn't believe they were alive and everybody wanted to know what happened and all that. But there's never it never wears off. You know what I mean? Like it didn't wear off in the 1950s. I don't think it would wear off now. I do think that in a literary sense, maybe it wouldn't be as shocking as surprising because of the prose and a lot of people do take a lot of inspiration by this type of story. But I think that it would still be pretty controversial today because
Yeah.
it never wears off. It doesn't become normal in that way. So,
Right.
go ahead.
And I think now too, with things like the Me Too movement and that sort of
Mm.
thing, I think, there's more emphasis on giving voice to victims.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like if you were to publish something like this, you would kind of open yourself up to a lot of
Yes.
criticism and a lot of
Yes.
flack, for
Yes.
sure.
I agree. I definitely agree. Do you have any final thoughts of either Lolita or the real Lolita? Would you recommend
Um,
either one to anybody?
yes, I would recommend both. And I actually liked that we read them both together. I think that really enhanced my reading experience for sure. Reading it with you is always a treat because you always have such great insight. But, you know, I think one thing that both of these books really illustrates for me is the odd, it just so weird preoccupation that society at that particular time and really even now um, has with female chastity and purity
Mm.
and how you know um, focused on that aspect of girls and women society is and how their
Mm.
value is really tied to that and the names that young girls are called and those sorts of things. I think that's one thing that really is brought out by both of these books. So, and I think
I
that's something that's always good to reflect on.
absolutely. I
Yeah.
certainly agree. And I had a good point when you said that, but I forgot what it was. I do think that I would recommend both of these books. I do think that someone who hasn't read Lolita, they're going to be like, Lolita? But having read it, it is a much more valuable book than I thought it was going to be. Like, I honestly thought it was going to be about bad, really, really bad stuff, and it was kind of going to be full of cringing. But
Yeah.
having read it and having this discussion with you, it showed me that there's so much more to learn about Lolita in that way and about people's attitudes and victimization and victim blaming and all of these other aspects that I didn't expect to get in Lolita. Like, I honestly thought it was just going to be some weird guy's diary, to be honest, which it is on a certain level.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when you're reading about it, when you're reading it and looking at the whole picture, it is so valuable because it forces you to talk about things that we wouldn't necessarily be talking about. I think that that's very, very valuable. I always like books that, you know, can make you do that. And I do agree with you that I like that we read the Sally Horner book along with it, because there were a lot of parallels and there were a lot of insights, and things that happened to Sally really enriched my reading of Lolita and my understanding of dynamics between Lolita and Humbert's manipulation, and but put it in a real life way that I can understand. You know what I mean? Like, it brings a little bit more depth into it. I'm very glad that we read this. I thank you so much for reading this with me. It is not an easy book to read. Neither one of them are by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think they're very important books. And I think that's what we had decided when we both read My Dark Vanessa. It's not an easy book, but it's an important book. And I'm glad that we both share that sentiment with these two as well. So, and with that, I think we shall close our Lolitathon.
That's it. That's a wrap.
Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for everybody who showed up. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed our discussion. And I think we're going to just continue our buddy reads. What do you think, Kari? What do you think?
I think the subscribers will see us again for sure.
I hope so.
On a live show.
I hope so. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. We hope that you've enjoyed this. Definitely give Lolita a chance, okay, with an open mind, okay? Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.